We'll have to build a little background, and to do that, we have to go to Exodus 25, 8 and 9, and then verse 40. And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them, according to all that I show thee, after the pattern of the tabernacle, and the pattern of all the instruments thereof, even so shall ye make it. So here we see that God had a pattern, and he had given instruction for this earthly sanctuary to be made according to that pattern. And of course, that pattern was in heaven. It would have been the heavenly sanctuary. And then at the end of the chapter it says, and look that thou make them after the pattern which was showed thee in the mount. So several times God stresses the fact, Moses, I've showed you by explaining the pattern, and you need to make it exactly like the pattern. So that means that the earthly sanctuary was, not a wonderful demonstration, but as good as human hands could make it, of the heavenly sanctuary. We find the same message in the New Testament, Hebrews 8, 1-5. We have such an high priest who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. So God made the heavenly sanctuary, man made the earthly sanctuary, and Jesus is the high priest in the heavenly sanctuary. And notice it calls it the true tabernacle. That's the pattern, the true tabernacle. For if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law. So here on earth, they had to follow what we call the ceremonial law that was given to Moses and explained how to do all of their worshiping of God, and that would be the daily service, the yearly service, the services of the feast days, all of that. He gave them instructions. But Jesus, if he was a priest on earth, well, he couldn't be a priest on earth. Why? He came from the wrong tribe, first of all. And so he only can minister in the heavenly sanctuary, who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things. Now pay attention to that word shadow. We have the heavenly sanctuary up in heaven, and it casts a shadow. And that shadow was the earthly sanctuary and all of its services. Then it says, who serve unto the example and shadow of heavenly things, as Moses was admonished of God when he was about to make the tabernacle. So here's a quote from the Old Testament. For see, saith he, that thou make all things according to the pattern showed to thee in the mount. So both the Old and New Testament point out that up in heaven is the true tabernacle with Jesus as the high priest. Now here's a key point. It's in Hebrews 9, 6, 9, 11, and 12. Now when these things were thus ordained, the priests went always into the first tabernacle. That's what we call the daily service. They, in the wilderness, all of Israel used that sanctuary, and they could use it any day that they needed it. When they moved into Canaan, it wasn't possible for everybody to go there every day, but there were still daily services in the sanctuary. But into the second went the high priest alone once every year. So nobody but the high priest could go in, and he had to go in alone. Not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. Now here's where they got mixed up. They thought there was some value in the offering of the blood of animals. But the blood of animals doesn't do any good. It was simply to teach them about the blood of Jesus, because his blood was the only blood that could do anything worthwhile. So, before he went in, and the same would be true of Jesus, Jesus couldn't go into the most holy place without the shedding of his own blood. The Holy Ghost, this signifying that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest, while as the first tabernacle was yet standing. So there was a change when the work of the earthly sanctuary ended and the work of the heavenly sanctuary started. And this was not understood until the death of Jesus, which was a figure for the time then present. But Christ, being common high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle. Now, of course, because it was made by divinity and angels and so on, whoever put that together, it was far superior in beauty and in every way. But it was also superior because Jesus was the high priest. Which was but Christ being come an high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this building, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered in, and I want you to pay attention of the word once. By his own blood he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. Now, we don't have time to study all the details here, but I'll just mention that when Jesus was inaugurated up in heaven, which was on the day of Pentecost, he entered into the holy place of the heavenly sanctuary. But he only entered once. And he ministered in the holy place until it was time to enter the most holy place, which he entered once and is still continuing his ministry in the most holy place. In the earthly sanctuary, they were entering every day in the holy place and once a year into the most holy place, but not so in the heavenly sanctuary. It was different because in the heavenly sanctuary, things are done once. Exodus 19, verse 5 and 8. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. So as God is going to be giving the Ten Commandments, and he gives a preview in chapter 19, and then he speaks the commandments in chapter 20, notice what the people respond. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Now, I don't believe that that's what God wanted as an answer. But of course, since he knows everything ahead of time, he knew that would be their answer. And so he entered into what is called the Old Covenant. And the Old Covenant was ratified by the blood of animals. But the problem is the Old Covenant could not help anybody to be saved. One time I was studying with a lady, and she was from the Church of Christ, but she had quit going to the Church of Christ. And so she was a little bit badgered by some of them and about the idea of becoming an Adventist. So she invited one of their leaders over to talk with me about some of these issues of salvation. So I felt impressed to ask him a question. I said, do you think anybody has been saved under the Old Covenant? He didn't dare answer. It was just like those traps that Jesus set for the Pharisees. If he said yes, he'd be in trouble. If he said no, he'd be going against what his church teaches, because they teach that people in the Old Testament were saved under the Old Covenant, but now we are saved under the New. But he didn't dare say that because he knew I could prove him wrong. So here we have the Old Covenant based on the promise of weak, faulty human beings, and we know they didn't keep it more than a few days. Probably didn't keep it even a day. In Hebrews, we find the New Covenant, chapter 8, verses 6 through 8. And the New Covenant belongs to the heavenly sanctuary, and the Old Covenant belongs to the earthly sanctuary. But he was trying to teach them about the New Covenant, even through the earthly. But now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant. So the priests were mediating in the earthly sanctuary about the Old Covenant, but Jesus is in the heavenly sanctuary under a better covenant, which was established upon better promises. Now here again, there's a lot of error taught about these two covenants. The Ten Commandments are the basic content of all the covenants. The Old Covenant had the Ten Commandments as their expectation. The New Covenant has the Ten Commandments as its expectation. But the difference is that the New Covenant is based on better promises, not the promise that humans could make. So it goes on to tell what that is. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. In other words, if the first covenant had worked, we wouldn't need the second, but it wouldn't work. For finding fault with them, he saith, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. So God says through Paul in Hebrews, that God understood that this old covenant wouldn't work, and so he planned a new covenant, a better covenant that would work, and it was based on better promises. Here's what the New Covenant promises are. Hebrews 8, 9, and 10. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant. So they broke the covenant right away. That's the reason when Moses came down from the mountain, he acknowledged they had broken the covenant by throwing down the 10 Commandments, smashing them to pieces in the sight of the people so that they could see, you have broken the covenant already. You said everything the Lord said you should do, that you would do it, but you haven't done it. And I regarded them not, saith the Lord, for this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind. Which laws? The 10 Commandment laws. I will put my laws into their mind and write them on their hearts. And I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. So the better promise was God promising to create a desire to keep the commandments in people's hearts. Now we know that some people will be saved from the Old Testament, and they were not saved by the Old Covenant, because nobody can be saved by the Old Covenant. So there has to be another covenant as well. And that one is called the everlasting covenant. Genesis 26, 3 through 5. And I will perform the oath which I share unto Abraham thy father, and I will make thy seed to multiply as the stars of heaven, and will give unto thy seed all these countries, not just Canaan. His plan was to give them the whole world. I will give unto them all these countries, and in thy seed, which means Jesus, shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. But now notice what God says to his son, Abraham's son. Because that Abraham obeyed my voice. Nobody can obey all of the commandments by their own power. So there had to be something else that Abraham had. Because Abraham obeyed my voice, God said, and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So he was obedient, as well as a whole lot of others. In Genesis 18, verse 19, God is speaking about Abraham. He says, for I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. So not only did Abraham obey the 10 Commandments, but he trained his family, which was 1,000 souls, more than 1,000 people. He trained them to be commandment keepers, and he showed them and explained to them how they could keep the commandments. This is what we call the everlasting covenant, and it's mentioned in Genesis 17, verse 7. And I will establish my covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. So the everlasting covenant was actually given to Adam and Eve. Now it's kind of sketchy, but if you understand this verse, you will see that it's promising the same thing as the new covenant. God is speaking, he says, and I will put enmity between thee, talking about Satan. He was addressing Satan in the form of the serpent, and the woman, which represents the church, represents the obedient people. How are they going to get enmity against Satan? Because once Adam and Eve listened to Satan, they immediately had a change to where they liked Satan and what he had to say. And they got what we call the carnal mind. Just like that. They got the carnal mind. The carnal mind loves sin. In fact, Romans says it can't even like what's right. It's impossible for the carnal mind to like what's right. So if you don't like what's right, even in some respects, the problem is you still got a carnal mind. But you don't have to keep it. That's the good news. God can put enmity against the things of Satan. Finishing the verse, it says, and between thy seed and her seed, that would be between Jesus and Satan, it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Now that was fulfilled because when Jesus died, the fact that he came out of the grave is looked at as only bruising his heel. But when Jesus deals with Satan, he's going to be dead forever. So his head is going to be bruised, and he'll never come to life again. So let's compare the new and the old covenant, as well as the everlasting. The everlasting covenant and the new covenant are exactly the same arrangement. And, you know, some people get mixed up because actually the everlasting covenant was the first covenant made with man. But the reason why the Bible calls the old covenant the first covenant is because it's going by when it was ratified. It was ratified by the blood of animals, and therefore it was the first covenant to be ratified. But both the everlasting and the new covenant were ratified by the blood of Jesus, which was later. So there's a few tricks in the situation, but you can figure it out if you study. Okay, under the everlasting or new covenant, we receive a new heart. And if we break that down, we receive new desires, we receive new purposes, and new motives. And of course, in those three things that we receive by a miracle, we hate sin now, and we love doing what's right. We may not always do what's right, but we'll never be happy again that we did wrong, because we have had created in us new desires, new purposes, and motives. That's what it means when God says, I'll write my law in your heart. But also, under the new covenant, we are being connected to divine power. So we have new desires, new purposes, and new motives, and we have infinite power connected with us so that we can obey. But the old covenant was attempting obedience by human power without a new heart. You know, I know that God is love, and so The only conclusion I can come to is that God was thinking, okay, I know they can't enter the new covenant right now, so I will enter the old covenant with them. And at some point, surely, they're going to find out that it doesn't work, and then they can have the new covenant. And by the way, there's a lot of Seventh-day Adventists that are trying to serve him under the old covenant, and God is hoping that those Adventists will wake up and realize it doesn't work, and that they should enter into the new covenant where God can do all these miracles for them. We don't have to get rid of the commandments to be obedient. We just need the new covenant. So, now we come to the ratification of the new covenant. And when that happens, the earthly sanctuary is over. It's of no value anymore. Notice Matthew 27, 50 and 51. Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. And behold, the veil was rent in twain from the top to the bottom. So it was ripped. Now, by the way, it was a very thick, I don't know, a couple inches thick, a very thick curtain. And no human being could have ripped that from the top to the bottom. And so God was opening up the most holy place. Previous, anyone that saw that would die. But everybody could see it now. Here's a couple of interesting facts. At the time of the Babylonian captivity, the Ark of the Covenant was hidden in a cave and never went back to the most holy place. Now, in the new temple that they made, they didn't have the ark in there. And this was a testimony to them, but they didn't really pay too much attention to it. However, in AD 70, the temple was completely destroyed. As Jesus had predicted, not one stone was left upon the other. God made sure that the people of earth knew the earthly sanctuary is over. First, he takes away the Ark of the Covenant and doesn't even give that back to them. And then he rips the curtain in two so that anybody that looks in there can see that it's essentially empty, except for maybe a few instruments, I don't know. And then he finally demolishes it. So it should be clear enough, shouldn't it? Now, a question came up because of the early church, especially the fact that they were reaching the Gentiles. And so in Acts 15:24, it tells about the council that they had as to how they were going to handle this problem of all those ceremonial laws. And, I mentioned circumcision, but if you look closely, you can see it's talking about way more than circumcision. For as much as we have heard that certain which went out from us troubled you with words subverting your souls. In other words, some of them were going around telling people, you got to keep all that ceremonial law. To do that, you had to ignore that the curtain got ripped from the top to the bottom. But saying, ye must be circumcised and keep the law, to whom we gave no such commandment. So the leaders of Israel did not ask for that to be done, but there were Jewish brethren who, were Christians now, and they thought that all this needed to be kept. And they went around trying to convince people to keep those things. Peter also said earlier in verse 10, "Now therefore, why tempt ye God to put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear?" So the old covenant was a discouraging road. And I believe there was a time in my life where I was trying to serve God under the old covenant, and it was very discouraging because I couldn't bring myself into line. I was brought up an Adventist. I knew what I should do, but I couldn't bring myself into line. So that's part of it. And the other part is, how would you like to have to be offering animals, day after day and year after year? That would not be something very joyful to do. It was a yoke. That's the yoke of bondage, not the Ten Commandments. Going back to the Old Testament, we see that there was a very important point about the difference between the Ten Commandments and the ceremonial law. In Deuteronomy 10, 1 and 2, it says, "At that time the Lord said unto me, Hew thee 2 tables of stone, like unto the first." So he smashed the first ones. "And I will write on the tables the words that were in the first tables, which thou breakest. And thou shalt put them" where? In the ark. Now, when they're in the ark, they're underneath the mercy seat, which is the throne of God. So it points out that the Ten Commandments are the rules of his government. But there were other laws. In Deuteronomy 31:26, "Take this book of the law and put it in the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God." So God treated the 2 laws differently. One was put in the side, and the other one was under the mercy seat. Now we can understand why Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 15 and 16, "Having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of twain." Now, if you read the verses before, he's talking about uniting Jew and Gentile. The 2 were to be united in the Christian church. So, in order to do that, God had to do away with the ceremonial law, to make in himself of twain one new man, so making peace, and that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby. Now, if there wasn't another one, that one, I could see where there might be misunderstanding. And yet it's clear if you understand the history. But in Colossians, Paul really makes it plain. Chapter 2, verses 14, 16, and 17. And it's kind of interesting that it's in Ephesians 2 and in Colossians 2. "Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances." Were the 10 Commandments handwritten? No. They were written by the finger of God. So it can't be talking about the ceremonial law. "Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to his cross. Now, it deals specifically next with the feast days. It says, "Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink." Now, there is no restriction on the Sabbath in regard to what you can eat on Sabbath and what you can't eat. But there were restrictions, especially in the Passover, but there were restrictions in the feast days. So he's pointing out here, yes, all the rest was nailed to the cross, including the feast days. Oops. Or in respect of an holy day, or of the new moon, or of the Sabbath days. Now, a surface reader thinks, the Sabbath was nailed to the cross. They fail to realize that there were two Sabbaths connected to Passover. Pentecost was a Sabbath, and there were two Sabbaths connected with the Feast of Tabernacles. And so it's obvious the context is saying the Sabbath days that belong to the feast days are done away with, which are a shadow of things to come. The Ten Commandments are not a shadow of anything. They will be eternal. But the provisions through the ceremonial law, including the feast days, were a shadow pointing to the heavenly sanctuary and to salvation through Jesus. Now, we're almost done. I'm sorry this is a little bit longer than I wanted it to be, but I couldn't cut it short. Hebrews 7:27, "Who needeth not daily," this is talking about Jesus, "as those high priests, to offer up sacrifice first for his own sins, and then for the people's, for this he did once, when he offered up himself." So he died once. That's all it took. And he can minister that blood and take care of the whole world. Also Hebrews 9:12, "Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us." Once he went in to the most holy place. And in 9:28, "So Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation." When we were having the Sabbath school quarterly on Hebrews, it really struck me why it's important to understand that what Jesus did in the heavenly sanctuary was once, not over and over again. So let's look at the feast days of the heavenly sanctuary. Well, Jesus died on the one Passover of the heavenly sanctuary, and we have this in Matthew 27:51-53. "The earth did quake, and the rocks rent, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose and came out of the graves after his resurrection." So the graves were opened when Jesus died, but when he came out of the grave, all these people came out and went into the holy city and appeared unto many. So they went around appearing to people and telling them they had been resurrected from the dead, in connection with Jesus. So that lays the foundation for Pentecost. Pentecost was the time to bring a sample of the harvest. They couldn't harvest. All they could take is some grains of their harvest, and to go down and celebrate Pentecost before they could harvest. So Pentecost was the time to bring a sample of the harvest. So on the one day of Pentecost of the heavenly sanctuary, Jesus was presenting the trophies from earth that went to heaven with him. And how do we know? Other than the text I read? Well, Ephesians 4:8 says, when he ascended up on high, he led captivity captive. In the margin of some Bibles say, a multitude of captives. So we don't know how many there was, but there was a multitude that went up to be with him in the heavenly sanctuary for the day of Pentecost. That was what the grains represented from their earthly harvest. And then it says he gave gifts unto men, which we know the gift of tongues was one of them, and other gifts as well. Feast of Tabernacles took place when all the harvests for the year were over. So the heavenly sanctuary will have one Feast of Tabernacles called the marriage supper of the Lamb. And we read that in Revelation 19:6-9. And I heard, as it were, the voice of a great multitude, and as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of mighty thundering, saying, Hallelujah, for the Lord God omnipotent reigneth. Let us be glad and rejoice, and give honor to him. For the marriage supper, or the marriage of the Lamb, is come, and his wife hath made herself ready. And to her was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white, for the fine linen is the righteousness of saints. And he saith unto me, Write, blessed are they which are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb. And then we have that long table that Ellen White was shown, where everybody is going to have this wonderful feast, the final communion service as well. And you can see through there that the heavenly sanctuary does things once. Jesus died once, everything else happened once, and the meaning was shown in the services that they had on earth, but in the heavenly one, it only gets done once. So may God bless us to not get tripped up with the feast day idea. I am in favor of spiritual vacations, however. That's basically what the feast days were. But we don't have to practice them on the certain days, that the feast days were given. You can go to camp meeting, you can go to ASI or whatever.